Welcome to the Greek Psalter, Joseph Smith as translator video. The Greek Psalter incident is pictured above here. This was in a book that was put out by a man named Henry Caswall. The book was called The Prophet of the 19th Century. And this is an illustration of the incident. The guy in the chair, kind of bent over looking at the manuscript, is Joseph Smith. What he's looking at is a Greek Psalter, and we'll go over what that is. The guy next to him is Henry Caswall, and the people off to the left here are some Mormons watching Joseph Smith evaluate this document or Greek Psalter. Okay, Psalter is a volume containing the book of Psalms from the Old Testament, which often contains other devotional material. They were popular in the Middle Ages, or as they sometimes say, medieval times. Middle Ages goes from 500 AD to 1500 AD. That's going to be an important little tidbit of information as we go through this video. And pictured above is a Greek Psalter. Kind of hard to see what the text looks like there, but that's kind of what it looks like. Okay, Henry Caswall received a BA degree from Kenyon College. He also studied Hebrew at the Andover Theological Seminary in Massachusetts. This is a picture of him above here. That's what he looks like. Very few pictures of him exist. Okay, in 1834, Henry Caswall became a professor of sacred literature at the Theological Seminary of the Protestant Episcopal Church in Lexington, Kentucky. So he was an Episcopalian, I guess they call him. He was also a reverend and an author. He authored a number of books, including a few about Joseph Smith and the Mormon Church. I believe this is an old picture of this theological seminary in Kentucky. All right, we're going to go through some preliminary statements before we get to Caswall's account. This Greek Psalter incident took place in 1842. Caswall wrote a book about it, which we'll get to, and we'll get to his account in much detail later on. This statement is here from Hugh Nibley in his book Myth Makers, which came out in 1961. You can see the cover pictured above. He kind of presents this fake dialogue between some people in this book, The Myth Makers. Nibley devoted a pretty large section of the book to this Greek Psalter incident, to this Caswall incident. So Nibley was doing a lot of apologetics on this very early on, 1961. So he says, this evening we have as our guest the man Henry Caswall, whose story of Joseph Smith and the Greek Psalter has been voted the most effective single contribution to anti-Mormon literature. That's a pretty strong statement. The most effective single contribution to anti-Mormon literature at the time, I guess, from what, 1842 to 1961. So this account from Caswall used to be a big deal. And I'll go over all the newspapers and books and stuff who covered this. But this is Nibley in 1961, devoting a pretty good amount of time to this issue because he didn't have to deal with the Book of Abraham issue yet. The Joseph Smith translation of the Egyptian papyri, which turned out Joseph Smith had no idea what Egyptian was, and he had no idea of how to translate the Egyptian papyri or the facsimiles. His explanations were basically just bogus. So about 5 years later, after this book was published, Nibley really had his hands full with the whole Book of Abraham incident. That happened in 1966, is when they found several fragments of the papyri that Joseph Smith used to write the Book of Abraham. These fragments were found in the archives of the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York, and then Nibley would devote a lot of his career to dealing with that problem. Okay, a Mormon writer by the name of Craig L. Foster did a whole article about this incident. Well, not about this incident, but more about Henry Caswall and then he mentions this incident in the article. Showed up in BYU Studies in 1995. Foster says that he, Henry Caswall, was in fact one of the most influential anti-Mormon writers of the 19th century. So Caswall's account used to be a big deal. Not a lot of modern Mormons even know about this incident. But if they watch this video, they will know. But yeah, Caswall, one of the most influential anti-Mormon writers of the 19th century. Okay, statement here by a man named David Fitzgerald. He's pictured on the right here. This is from his book, The Mormons. It is one of the books of the Complete Heretic's Guide to Western Religion. Fitzgerald also wrote a book called Nailed, which is about the historical Jesus. He doesn't think Jesus even existed. But here he actually in this book, he has a few pages on the Greek Psalter incident. He says, in 1842, Dr. Henry Caswall, an Episcopal minister visiting from England, decided to go undercover and try to expose Joseph Smith as a fraud. He succeeded admirably. Yeah, key part right there. He succeeded admirably. Okay, Fawn Brodie talked about this a little bit in her book, No Man Knows My History, 1945. Still one of the best biographies of Joseph Smith out there. Written all the way back in 1945. Brodie's pictured above. In the book, she says, one visitor, Henry Caswall, an Episcopalian preacher from a St. Louis college, armed himself with an ancient manuscript Psalter written in Greek and pretending to be ignorant of its contents, offered it up to Joseph Smith for his scrutiny. So another key thing to remember here, this Psalter was in Greek. Henry Caswall knew that it was in Greek. That'll come into play later. All right, so another statement here from Brodie, getting to the crux of the issue here. Under the prophet's questioning, he, Henry Caswall, finally admitted that he believed the language to be Greek of the Psalter, but this Joseph Smith contradicted. Joseph Smith said that it is a dictionary of Egyptian hieroglyphics. So that's basically the crux of the issue there. It was a Greek Psalter, but Joseph Smith said, no, it's a dictionary of Egyptian hieroglyphics. So if Joseph Smith is acting as a prophet here, he doesn't understand this Greek, and he doesn't understand Egyptian. Pictured above, we have one example of an Egyptian hieroglyphic dictionary. This Psalter was not that. All right, so we have a Hugh Nibley in 1961 saying this is a big issue. Henry Caswall, the biggest anti-Mormon of the 19th century. That used to be a big deal, right? But if you look at Richard L. Bushman's book, Rough Stone Rolling, he doesn't even mention it. So we got Brodie mentioning it, we got Nibley mentioning it, but now in 2005 in Rough Stone Rolling, Richard Bushman completely ignores this issue. Why did he do that? Does he think it's not a strong case? Does he not want to draw attention to an issue that most Mormons don't know about? Don't know. That's another question for Richard Bushman, but he doesn't mention the Greek Psalter incident in this book. A guy named William O. Nelson, pictured above, did write a little bit about this in the Encyclopedia of Mormonism. It's under the section Anti-Mormon Publications, pages 47 and 48 of Volume 1. He says, Reverend Henry Caswall published The City of the Mormons, or 3 Days at Nauvoo in 1842. That's the book that we're going to go over later, the big long account of what Caswall said happened. Came out in 1842. That's the earliest account that we have of this incident. He claimed that he gave Joseph Smith a copy of a Greek manuscript of the Psalms, and that Joseph Smith identified it as a dictionary of Egyptian hieroglyphics. So there it has a mention in the Encyclopedia of Mormonism, at least. Okay, historian John J. Hammond mentions this in his book, Swimming in Deep Water, Mormon Nauvoo in 1842. Hammond says, Joseph Jr. must not have suspected that Caswall knew the language of his Greek Psalter, and Joseph Smith, always eager to show off his supposed knowledge of ancient languages, he, Joseph, only demonstrated his arrogance and ignorance. Couldn't read the Greek, couldn't read the Egyptian, misidentified this manuscript as an Egyptian dictionary. All right, a statement here from the Apostle John A. Widstow in his book, Joseph Smith, Seeker After Truth, Prophet of God, came out in 1951. That's pictured on the right. Widstow, the apostle, pictured on the left. One of the only apostles ever to mention this issue. Yeah, there might just be one or two. But he says, Reverend Henry Caswall, M.A., an Englishman, a professor of divinity in Kemper College, St. Louis, Missouri, spent 3 days in 1842 in civilian dress in Nauvoo. So he wasn't dressed up like a reverend when he came to Nauvoo. Kind of wanted to maybe hide his identity. I think he did have in mind that he wanted to trick or expose Joseph Smith as a fraud, basically. This Kemper College, I don't think ever got off the ground. I don't think any students ever showed up and paid tuition. That's according to the BYU Studies article. But Caswall had previously been a professor at another university. Yeah, so there's that. Okay, so another statement here from the Apostle John A. Widstow, same source. He, Henry Caswall, told about the sport that he had in fooling Joseph Smith and the people whom he met into believing that a Greek Psalter that he had with him was a new find, perhaps a lost scripture for the prophet to decipher. I think that's what the Mormons around Joseph Smith were saying, not necessarily Caswall. That the Mormons were saying maybe this is another lost scripture that Joseph Smith needs to translate. Here's a page from a Greek Psalter. Yeah, you can see this Greek looks pretty strange. I don't think it looks like 19th century Greek or modern Greek. Okay, the final slide here from Widstow, doing a little bit of apologetics here. If Joseph Smith called attention to the similarity of a letter in the Psalter to an Egyptian symbol, it became at once in Caswall's memory evidence of the prophet's ignorance. That really wasn't the issue. That's a straw man here. It's not just the fact of him pointing out similarities in letters between Greek and Egyptian. It's basically that he doesn't understand this ancient Greek, this Middle Ages Greek, or Egyptian. He doesn't understand either of it, but he was pretending to, saying, yes, this is an Egyptian dictionary. So Caswall really did provide evidence of the prophet's ignorance. All right, two other guys that you would expect to cover this issue. I guess they just left it to Nibley. These are Bruce R. Mcconkey and Joseph Fielding Smith, apostles, and then Smith went on to become the prophet for a short amount of time. They never mention this Greek Psalter incident in any of their books or speeches. It's like it never happened. Probably because they thought it was too controversial to mention. Before we found the papyri in 1966, this was probably one of the most controversial issues around, and maybe that's why they never ever mentioned it, or possibly they never heard about it. I kind of doubt that. Okay, Grant Palmer covered this issue in Insider's View of Mormon Origins, came out in 2002. Palmer's pictured above. Palmer says Henry Caswall's experience with Joseph Smith at Nauvoo on the 18th and 19th of April 1842, so there's the date of it, expresses the frustration of an increasing number of LDS students with Joseph Smith's ability to translate ancient documents. So we have a track record here. We have a pattern, and Palmer's going to talk about that. All right, Palmer continues. Here's the cover here. pictured of insider's view of Mormon origins. So Palmer says he, Henry Caswall, decided to test Joseph Smith's credibility by presenting him with a known ancient Greek Psalter for his examination. Okay, Palmer continues. Caswall's account is consistent with Joseph Smith's pattern of rather quickly determining the value and content of unknown documents that were presented to him. Palmer's conclusion is that a large body of evidence demonstrates that Joseph Smith mistranslated a number of documents. And this is just another example of that. All right, I, Grant Palmer, know of no substantial evidence to support Joseph Smith's claim to have ever literally translated any document. Kind of a crazy statement. Palmer knows of no evidence showing that Joseph Smith literally translated any document from one language to another. There's nothing. I did a video on the Green Mountain Boys document, and he did a couple lines in there where he actually did translate some things correctly. I think the name of that video is Joseph Smith Translates 13 Different Languages. You can go back and watch that one. But he's just doing, some of them are pretty easy, like French and Spanish and whatnot. But just translating like a line or two here or there. So this leaves me, Grant Palmer, to appreciate Joseph Smith's writings at face value rather than because of their antiquity. All right, a couple statements again from Craig L. Foster in the BYU Studies article. In the spring of 1842, a young Englishman, Henry Caswall, arrived in Nauvoo with an important mission. He was an Anglican clergyman. He had set aside his clerical apparel and was dressed as an ordinary traveler. I guess Anglican is just another word for Episcopalian. Okay, so Foster continues. In Henry Caswall's possession was an ancient Greek Psalter, with which he planned to prove once and for all that Joseph Smith, the American prophet, was a fraud. All right, a guy named T.H. Gregg talked about this in his book, The History of Hancock County, Illinois, which came out in 1880. I guess that's the title page, or maybe it's the front cover pictured above. Gregg says that Professor Caswall paid a visit to Nauvoo and the Mormon prophet Joseph Smith. He had in his possession a Greek Psalter of great age. The Psalter was handed over to Joseph Smith. The spirit of prophecy descended upon Joseph, and he said that this book I pronounce to be a dictionary of ancient Egyptian hieroglyphics. No, it wasn't. It was all in ancient Greek, Middle Ages Greek. All right, another account of this is from the Apostle John Taylor, who he went on to become the prophet of the church. So we do have a few accounts here from different people showing that Caswall really did show up. This incident really did happen. There was a lot of witnesses of it, and a few accounts have survived. This is one of them. This can be found, I believe it's a pamphlet, 3 nights public discussion between some reverends and poor elder or Apostle John Taylor up in kind of a debate here. So let's see. Taylor says, concerning Mr. Caswall, I, the Apostle John Taylor, was at Nauvoo during Caswall's visit, or during the time of his visit. I saw Mr. Caswall in the printing office at Nauvoo. He had with him an old manuscript. That was the Greek Psalter, and he professed to be anxious to know what it was. All right, here we have part of the title page for this pamphlet, 3 nights public discussion between some reverends and John Taylor. So this is a few pages on in, page 32. Mr. Caswall showed me the Apostle John Taylor an old manuscript, which was the Psalter, and Caswall ranted to know what it was. I told him that I believed it was Greek. In his book that he published against the Latter-day Saints, Caswall acknowledged that it was a Greek Psalter. I don't think John Taylor is telling the truth here. This is an ancient type of Greek, back maybe around 1200 or 1300 AD. It was not the type of Greek that you would see in the 19th century or in the modern day. There was very little chance that John Taylor would have known that this was ancient Greek. Maybe John Taylor is pretending to know because Caswall told him that it was Greek later on, which of course he did. But John Taylor was known to lie about things. He lied about polygamy and some other things as well. All right, there was also an account of this incident in the Times and Seasons. That was a church newspaper in America, in Nauvoo, I believe. This article came out called Reward of Merit, October 15, 1843, so about a year to 18 months after the incident. But in this Times and Seasons, it says, and I believe the editor was John Taylor and some other guy, I can't remember. But it says, it will be recollected by some that a Mr. Caswall, professing to be an Episcopal minister, came to this city, Nauvoo, some 12 or 18 months ago. So the Times and Seasons did mention this. Okay, so the Times and Seasons account here again. Henry Caswall, had with him an old manuscript, which was the Greek Psalter, professing to be ignorant of its contents, and came to Joseph Smith, as he said, for the purpose of having it translated. So yeah, Times and Seasons church newspaper mentioned it. So it did happen. Here is a cover of one of the Times and Seasons. It's not this 1843 one. This one is 1841. All right, I found an interesting account here from the Church History Library online digital collection. As far as I know, this source has not been published by anybody else, so probably very, very few people are aware of this letter. It's a letter from the mission president Reuben Hedlock to the Apostle Willard Richards. Hedlock was the mission president in Liverpool, England at the time, just starting out, I believe, in October 16, 1843, so maybe a year and a half after the incident took place. So this is also a early account. Easy to get, or pretty easy to get converts in Liverpool because they're poor and working class. A lot harder to get rich people over there in London. But I'm sure they got some converts in London as well. But, all right, so Hedlock's letter, he says, a work published of late by the Mr. Caswall, who you will recollect was in Nauvoo with an old manuscript book, which was the Greek Psalter. I will here give you a quotation or two from the book. And he's talking about the book, The Prophet of the 19th Century, which came out in 1843. About 1 year later, from Caswall's initial account, the City of the Mormons in 1842. So here we have another account, another letter talking about this incident really happening. Okay, Caswall's story was covered in at least 5 newspapers, as well as many early books and magazines critical of Mormonism. So in the 19th century, this account was all over the place. It was in a ton of anti-Mormon books, if you want to use that phrase. I use it in quotations, anti-Mormon in quotations, because there's very few people that are really anti-LDS people. We're just anti-lies and anti-false doctrine. So yeah, it was covered in 5 newspapers. The Sun in New York in 1842. The Warsaw the Warsaw Message in Illinois in 1843. The Davenport Gazette in Iowa in 1843. The Long Island Democrat in New York in 1844. And the Bangor, is that how you say that? Bangor Daily Whig and Courier in Maine in 1844. So this story was everywhere. Okay, a couple statements here from Mormon apologist John W. Welch. He had a chapter in a book entitled Approaching Antiquity. It was like a desert book, BYU kind of a book. It came out in 2015. Covers pictured above here, but Welch says it appears that the encounter did in fact occur. It appears that Caswall did actually meet Joseph Smith. Some apologists in the past have kind of denied this, but I have enough evidence here to prove that it did occur as well. And Welch here being a little more honest, about 6 years ago when he talks about this issue. All right, so I found this statement to be very interesting, again by Mormon apologist John W. Welch. Same chapter in the book Approaching Antiquity, but he's basically saying that the type of Greek in the 13th century or in the Byzantine era or medieval times, that ancient type of Greek is nothing like the Greek that they would have in the 19th century or in the modern era. This is why I believe that John Taylor was lying, that he could tell that it was Greek, and this is why Joseph Smith could not tell that it was Greek either. There's been some apologists that have said that Joseph Smith had a Greek lexicon, and so he would have known what Greek was, and Caswall wouldn't have been able to fool him because Joseph Smith would have known Greek because he had studied a little bit out of his Greek lexicon. But this is an ancient form of Greek, 13th century or Middle Ages Greek. Very unlikely that Joseph Smith would have known what it was. Very unlikely that John Taylor would have known what it was. So this is all good research here from John Welch. Sometimes their research works in my favor. So Welch says the entire Greek text on the Psalter, if truly written in a 13th century Byzantine script, that's when Caswall was kind of guessing when this Psalter was written, but sometime during the Middle Ages. If truly written in a 13th century Byzantine script, would likely be indecipherable to anybody not trained to read medieval Greek scripts such as Joseph Smith. Joseph Smith was not trained to read medieval or Middle Ages Greek, 13th century Byzantine script. Joseph wouldn't have known what this was. Many good classicists cannot readily read every Greek script any more than all English speakers can read 13th century Old English manuscripts. Many Greek scripts look very unusual, and this may be what some medieval Greek looks like here, pictured above. Okay, so those are the preliminary statements and information that I wanted to go over before we got to Caswall's account. That took up about a half an hour of time. We're now going to go to Caswall's book, The City of the Mormons, 3 Days at Nauvoo, which came out in the later part of 1842. I believe it's around 90 pages, so kind of in between a pamphlet and a short book. But he dedicates quite a bit of the space in these 90 pages to this Greek Psalter incident. Cover page, kind of what it looks like here above. He says, I, Henry Caswall, determined to visit the stronghold of Nauvoo, Illinois, of the new religion, Mormonism, and to obtain, if possible, an interview with the prophet Joseph Smith himself. Accordingly, on Friday evening, April 15, 1842, I embarked on board the fine steamer called the Republic. Okay, so moving on with Caswell's account. This is the earliest account that we have, and it's also the longest and most detailed. So that's the one I use for this, the City of the Mormons book or pamphlet. He covers it in some of his other books as well, and we'll go over a few short statements in the Prophet of the 19th Century book, which came out a year later as well. But Caswell says, in order to test the scholarship of the prophet, I had further provided myself with an ancient Greek manuscript of the Psalter written upon parchment and probably about 600 years old, which would date it to about 1242 A.D. That's where John Welch got his date of around the 1300 A.D. That's probably a guess on Caswell's part, but these Greek Psalters are ancient. And occurred, they were written sometime during the Middle Ages, usually. Pictured above here, we have some events that happened in the Middle Ages. We had the collapse of Rome. We had the rise of the Byzantine Empire. That's why Welch was talking about that Byzantine script. We had the rise of Islam, the Viking Age, and then Christianity started to spread. That's the early Middle Ages, and other stuff happened later on. Okay, so Caswell continues. On the following morning, which was Monday, April 18th, I took my venerable Greek manuscript of the Psalter. Arriving at the city of Nauvoo, I passed along a straggling street of considerable length, bordering on the Strand. And here we have a picture of modern-day Nauvoo. All right, Caswell continues. I accordingly unfolded the Greek Psalter from the many wrappers in which I had enveloped it, and in the presence of the storekeeper and many astonished spectators, Mormons, whom the rumor of the arrival of a strange book had collected, I produced to view its covers of worm-eaten oak, as pictured above, its discolored parchments, and its mysterious characters. Joseph Smith wasn't around at this time. Joseph Smith would see the Psalter the next day. All right, Caswell continues. City of the Mormons, 3 days at Nauvoo, 1842. Surprise was depicted on the countenances of all present, all these Mormons. And after a long silence, one person wiser than his fellows declared that he knew it to be a revelation from the Lord, and that probably it was one of the lost books of the Bible providentially recovered. Well, I believe the New Testament was originally written in Greek, but this is the Psalms from the Old Testament. I believe the Old Testament written in Hebrew, so probably not a lost book of the Bible, but you can get books on this. Here's a cover of one of them of lost books of the Bible, stuff that didn't make it in, but was really from real Christians. All right, so Caswell continues. Looking at me with a patronizing air, he assured me that I had brought it to the right place to get it interpreted, for that none on earth but the Lord's prophet Joseph Smith could explain it or unfold its real antiquity and value. Joseph Smith was the only one that could translate it or reveal its antiquity and value. And all these translation projects is what got Joseph Smith in trouble. It's basically what definitively shows that he was a fraud. Okay, so the story continues. Numerous Mormons begged to be permitted to see and handle the wonderful book, in other words, the Psalter. They all looked upon it as something supernatural, very superstitious people, and they considered that I undervalued it greatly, by reason of my ignorance of its contents. All right, so there's a pretty interesting account in this book, The City of the Mormons, when Caswell met with Joseph Smith's mother, Lucy Mack Smith. And historians like to look at that account in there of Lucy Mack Smith showing him some of the papyri and claiming that she had seen the golden plates and claiming that she had seen the Urim and Thummim and all these things. Caswell came to the conclusion that Lucy Mack Smith was in on the fraud with Joseph Smith. So historians like to use this Lucy Mack Smith story in this book, and Mormon historians like to use the City of the Mormons for other historical issues. They just don't like to use it for the Greek Psalter incident because that is problematic for them. So anyway, we're not going to go too much into the story there in the that he was talking to Lucy Mack Smith about, but we are going to mention a little bit of it. He says, I produced my wonderful book, or Psalter. The old woman, who was Lucy Mack Smith, scrutinized its pages, and in an oracular manner, like an oracle, in an oracular manner, assured me that the Lord was now bringing to light the hidden things of darkness, according to his word, that my manuscript was doubtless a revelation which had long been hidden, and which was now to be made known to the world by means of her son, the prophet Joseph. Okay, so the account continues. The Mormon authorities now formally requested me to sell them the book, or Psalter, for which they were willing to pay a high price. You know, just like they bought those Egyptian papyri from the traveling salesman. What was his name? Chandler. They paid a pretty high price for those. They were willing to pay a high price for this Greek Psalter. And who knows, if they would have been able to got it, maybe Joseph Smith would have made another book of scripture out of it. This I positively refused, and they next importuned me to lend it to them so that the prophet Joseph might translate it. Caswell denied that. Not sure why he didn't want to sell it. You know, he must have had his reasons. Okay, so on the date of April 19, 1842, Henry Caswell advanced with his book, or Psalter, in his hand. Numerous Mormons came forth from their dwellings, begging to be allowed to see its mysterious pages. Superstitious and uneducated people, and ancient language is really not very well understood at the time, probably. And by the time I reached the prophet Joseph's house, they amounted to a perfect crowd. Okay, Henry continues. I met Joseph Smith at a short distance from his dwelling, maybe the red brick store, and was regularly introduced to him. I had the honor of an interview with him, who is a prophet, a seer, a merchant, a revelator, a president, an elder, an editor, and the general of the Nauvoo Legion. Yeah, no big ego on Joseph Smith, right? Okay, I handed the book, or Psalter, to the prophet Joseph Smith and begged him to explain its contents. He asked me if I had any idea of its meaning. I replied that I believed it to be a Greek Psalter. So Caswell didn't lie to him. He said he believed. Well, he used the word believe, so he's lying a little bit because he actually didn't believe it. He knew it to be Greek. But that I should like to hear his opinion. Joseph Smith said, no, he said, it ain't Greek at all, except perhaps for a few words. Some people have pointed out that Joseph Smith didn't use this kind of bad grammar in the Nauvoo period. Not sure how much he outgrew that. You know, the original Book of Mormon has all kinds of bad grammar in it, so maybe he grew out of that somewhat. All right, so here's a very important part of the account, page 36 of Caswell's book. So he says, Joseph Smith continued on and said, What ain't Greek is Egyptian, and what ain't Egyptian is Greek. This book is very valuable. It is a dictionary of Egyptian hieroglyphics. Pointing to the capital letters at the commencement of each verse, he said, them figures is Egyptian hieroglyphics, and them which follows is the interpretation of the hieroglyphics, written in the Reformed Egyptian. Well, all this Egyptian stuff that he's talking about being a dictionary of Egyptian hieroglyphics, having some Egyptian characters, the capital letters at the beginning of each verse being Egyptian, and then what follows being Reformed Egyptian. All this was BS. It was all Greek. Okay, so the account continues. Joseph Smith says, them characters is like the letters that was engraved on the golden plates. No, they weren't. They were not Reformed Egyptian. Upon this, the Mormons around began to congratulate me on the information I was receiving. There, they said, we told you so. We told you that our prophet would give you satisfaction. None but our prophet can explain these mysteries. All right, so maybe Caswell wanted to keep this Psalter as kind of an investment or kind of a retirement, because he said he could sell it, later on and maybe live on it for a whole year. So Caswell says, the prophet now turned to me and said, this book or Psalter ain't of no use to you. You don't understand it. Oh, yes, I replied, it is of some use. For if I were in want of money, I could sell it and obtain perhaps enough to live on for a whole year. All right, what will you take for it? Said the prophet and his elders. My price, I replied, is higher than you would be willing to give. And what price is that? They all eagerly demanded. I replied, or Caswell replied, I will not tell you what price I would take, but if you were to offer me this moment $900 in gold for it, which would be about $25,000 today, you should not have it. I believe Joseph Smith and the Mormons bought the Egyptian papyri for, what, $2,000 or $2,500? Okay, they then repeated their request that I should lend it to them until the prophet should have time to translate it, and promised me that the most ample security, but I declined all of their proposals. It would have really been cool if he would have given it to them. And then we could see the bogus translation that would come out of it, just like we did with the Book of Abraham. I placed the book or Psalter in several envelopes, and as I deliberately tied knot after knot, the countenances of many among them gradually sunk into an expression of great despondency. Okay, Caswell continues. Having exhibited the book or Psalter to the prophet, I requested him in return to shew me his papyrus, and to give me his own explanation, which I had hitherto received only at second hand. So apparently Caswell kind of knew of some of the interpretations from the papyri. He might have known some of the explanations for the facsimiles, which were total bogus. All right, Joseph Smith, proceeded with me to his office, accompanied by the multitude. He produced the glass frames which I had seen on the previous day, which I guess Lucy Mack Smith showed him. But he did not appear very forward to explain the figures. Well, he did all that later, and we have that in the Pearl of Great Price now, all his explanations, of the facsimiles. This is an interesting picture I found. It looks like some kind of a nameplate. It says Joseph Smith's office. President of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Not sure where that was. Maybe his Nauvoo office. All right, Caswell continues. I pointed to a particular hieroglyphic and requested him to expound its meaning. No answer being returned, I looked up, and behold, the prophet had disappeared. So Maybe by this time Joseph Smith was detecting, smelling a scoundrel here, that maybe Caswell was trying to trick him. Okay, the Mormons told me that he, Joseph Smith, had just stepped out and would probably soon return. I waited some time, but in vain, and at length descended to the street in front of the store. So that's why I think all this maybe took place in the red brick store, because he talks about descending to the street in front of the store. All right, so in front of the red brick store, Caswell heard the noise of wheels, and presently I saw the prophet in his wagon, flourishing his whip and driving away as fast as two fine horses could draw him. So, he tells a pretty good story here. Okay, the Mormons now surrounded me and requested to know whether I had received satisfaction from the prophet's explanation. I replied that the prophet had given me no satisfaction and that he had committed himself most effectually. He had committed himself to this idea that the Greek Psalter was a dictionary of Egyptian hieroglyphics. All right, your prophet Joseph Smith has committed himself today, and I will make the fact known to the world. Would you believe a man calling himself a prophet who should say that black is white? No, they replied. Would you believe him if he should say that English is French? Certainly not, the Mormon said. All right, I, Henry Caswell, know that the Psalter is most positively the Psalms of David, written in ancient Greek. Now what shall I think of your prophet? So he was a professor at the time. He had studied Hebrew. Not sure if he had studied Greek. Probably. He was being a reverend and went to a theological seminary. And maybe he showed it to other experts that were able to identify, other people in the academic community that were able to identify it as Greek. All right, and now we get to a statement from Willard Richards that we still hear today, that general authorities will just say, oh, that was just the prophet speaking as a man. He wasn't really speaking as a prophet at that time. He was just giving you his scholarly opinion. But it really doesn't work very well for Joseph Smith, because that was one of Joseph Smith's high callings, to be a translator of ancient documents, as it says in the Doctrine and Covenants. All right, so Caswell continues. The Mormons appeared confounded for a while, but at length the Mormon doctor, who was the Apostle Willard Richards, said, sometimes Mr. Smith speaks as a prophet and sometimes as a mere man. If he gave a wrong opinion respecting the book, he spoke as a mere man. Willard Richards, pictured above. And you remember that letter that was written by Reuben Hedlock to Willard Richards as well. So he was familiar with this issue. All right. So what was Caswell's response to Willard Richards? Well, he uses some good reasoning and logic here. He says, whether Joseph Smith spoke as a prophet or as a mere man, he has committed himself, for he has said what is not true. If he spoke as a prophet, therefore he is a false prophet. Okay, Caswell continues with his reasoning. If he, Joseph Smith, spoke as a mere man, he cannot be trusted, for he spoke positively and like an oracle respecting that of which he knew nothing. So, whether he was a prophet or a man, he's still a liar, right? And he cannot be trusted. He's pretending to know things for which he knows nothing. Okay, so that's going to do it for the earliest account, the City of the Mormons, 1842. He took a lot of this information and other information that he had and turned it into a full-length book, which was called The Prophet of the 19th Century. And we're going to go through a couple statements from that book to finish up this video. This was 1843, so maybe a year and a half after the first book was published. You can see the title page here. So he says in this book, the author of this work, Henry Caswall, visited Nauvoo, Illinois in April of 1842 and had the honor of an interview with Joseph Smith and many of his people. All right. When an ancient Greek manuscript of the Psalms was exhibited to Joseph Smith as a test of his scholarship, Joseph Smith boldly pronounced it to be a dictionary of Egyptian hieroglyphics. And I have to say, this sounds totally typical of Joseph Smith. So in this book, there was an illustration, and that was, you see it on the left-hand side here. That's kind of my cover art for this video. All right, so he reiterates in this book some of the things Joseph Smith said, the prophet of the 19th century, and this was a pretty influential early anti-Mormon quote-unquote book. Pointing to the capital letters at the commencement of each verse, Joseph Smith said, "Them figures is Egyptian hieroglyphics, and them which follows is the interpretation of the hieroglyphics, written in the reformed Egyptian language. Them characters is like the letters that was engraven on the golden plates." So Joseph Smith sees Egyptian everywhere. Okay, Joseph Smith afterwards proceeded to show his papyrus and to explain the inscriptions, but probably suspecting that the author Henry Caswall designed to entrap him, he suddenly left the apartment or the red brick store, leaped into his light wagon, and drove away as fast as possible. We have some of these hieratic characters here, which Joseph Smith turned in to the Book of Abraham. These are the characters that were right to the left of facsimile 1. The author, Henry Caswall, could not properly avoid expressing his opinion of the prophet to the assembled Mormons. Kind of dangerous. They could have hurt him or killed him. And was engaged for several hours in a sharp controversy with various eminent dignitaries. All right, so we see the pattern of Joseph Smith. Every time we're able to test his translations, he turns out to be a fraud. All the Egyptian papyri we have, the facsimiles, he got none of that right. All of the explanations for the facsimiles, especially, which is really easy to understand, all of them except maybe one are all wrong. When he had the Kinderhook plates brought to him, also to entrap him, he pretended that he could translate those, and he gave a brief explanation of the translation. He got all that wrong. Greek Psalter incident, same thing, saying it's all this kind of Egyptian and everything when it's only Greek. So every time we're able to test him as a translator, he fails. We are not able to test him on the Book of Mormon because we don't have the original golden plates. But if there was original golden plates, he probably would have failed the translation of them as well. But of course, we know that there was no golden plates. But that's going to do it for this video, and I thank you for watching the Greek Psalter, Joseph Smith as translator video.